So welcome, Senator Pancione Zayas. I hope I've said it correctly.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pandey.
You're welcome. And not only are you a senator, you are an early childhood education specialist with a doctorate degree from my alma mater, UIUC, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And we're so proud of you, not just in terms of what you've done for Illinois, but nationally as well. So welcome to this podcast, the Early Childhood Education Podcast. It is my pleasure to have you on. And I am the chair of the Early Childhood Special Interest Group at the National Association for Bilingual Education. And I have a lot of questions for you. First, I wanted to ask you, Senator, what role did your expertise in early childhood and your being a parent? I know that you have a child. Her kindergarten teacher is now pursuing her doctorate. I know that we talked at the this past week at the National Association for Bilingual Education meeting via Zoom, and she was excitedly telling me that she had the honor of having your daughter in her class. Mm-hmm. So what role has your expertise in early childhood education and your being a parent, I know these are two separate things, played in your journey from ESL specialist and advocate to policymaker?
I think it's been a great kind of like pool of knowledge and lived experience to draw from. And thank you so much for having me on this podcast and having the conversation. I think, one of the things that has been incredibly important is, coming to the space as a policymaker with not just professional experience and training and, degrees and all of that, but also having lived experience as well as opportunity to apply knowledge, being a practitioner. And I bring all of that to bear in the work that I do with policymaking, but then also to ensure that it's not just me being a voice that's singular, but also using the platform to center and bring in voices that historically have not been at the table when it comes to policy. So I think it's the combination of all those things. And then on top of it, being a mom of, two children that have experienced all of the various settings where early care and education take place, a licensed family childcare home, community-based, center-based program for the early years, like infant toddler classroom, and then preschool, and then school-based preschool. And then my son went through early intervention. So I really had a front seat to understand, one, opportunities that early care and education that's high quality, that's culturally and linguistically responsive, that positive impact it can make on a child's development and supporting the family or the guardians or caregivers, but two, to also understand the fractures in the system and how, that can be very daunting. And even with a PhD and even with, strong advocacy chops and also working in the system and understanding and navigating it, I found myself at times, struggling. And I think, if I'm struggling with all of this support, what is the experience for people who don't have those resources or access to the resources? What is that experience for somebody whose language is not English, their first language? What is that experience for, somebody who may have had personally as a young child adverse experiences in the system? So I really try to always kind of like bring folks into the conversation and put a spotlight on their voice, their experience. I think it has a very different feeling in terms of the way that I do the work, because I'm just here to quarterback things. I want to pave the way for people to come in and tell their stories and provide solutions and really point to the complexity and the nuance of the system, so we can, design better avenues for outcomes that benefit children and families.
That sounded so powerful. And that's where it starts, with policy, because if there's no policy in place, then number one, things happen in a very haphazard manner, and two, a lot of folks are left out, especially the most vulnerable. So this is really, really exceptional. I was so excited to read and hear about the Early Childhood Committee that is now in the 103rd General Assembly, of which you are the chair. I also read with you helped dismantle harmful testing practices with your work with Too Young to Test Act, which is just phenomenal because absolutely, not only does it cause anxiety, it also assumes that every child is linguistically ready to be tested, particularly the dominant language, including in Illinois. I'm assuming even though in the 20s, Illinois was an English-only state, but in '69 there was an amendment made, and so I'm just curious. Some of these policy initiatives, could you tell us which one you're the most proud of, and how things are going to pan out for early childhood educators? That includes the parents, especially low income and linguistically removed, let me say removed in the sense often overlooked or marginalized parents may not be perceived to have the fluency in English, or they may be hesitant about their English skills. And number two, for the teachers and the staff and the support staff, including translators. And then, of course, for the principals and administrators. And then finally, for the ESL offices at the local boards of education at the county level, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick your favorite bill because they're all babies and you love them all in the same type of level and quantity, but obviously in different ways. The Too Young to Test bill I can start with. And that bill was actually brought to me by a local advocacy group known as Illinois Families for Public Schools. They're a part of a larger coalition that is really looking to reimagine our assessment system and how it's utilized within our schools. They knew, obviously, I'm very comfortable speaking to the developmental science around early childhood, the brain science, and that I would be able to kind of ground it in that body of work. But what they were really trying to do was, as a part of Too Young to Test, really kind of problematize in general standardized testing and how it's been utilized within our school systems to sort, to humiliate, and also to profit.
Thank you.
The companies that create these assessments that then also add on curriculum and professional development. I mean, it's a big industry.
It's an industry, absolutely.
So the thinking was, let's start with the early years because we know the science is there to justify that, the early years are so fluid in development. And when you use a standardized assessment, it really begins to kind of call into question the validity and the value of it. Because, a child may present mastering a particular skill or an application of a skill one day, and then the next day they don't. There something may have happened or whatever. But the point is that we acknowledge that development is so fluid in those first 5 years, and to impose a standardized assessment, whether it's norm referenced or criterion referenced, is really just it's a fool's errand. Who is this really benefiting? And it calls into question, is this really about profit? Is this really about preparing students for later when they get to take the standardized tests in third grade and, all of the hoopla around that marker, that benchmark? And so The bill, what it does is it proposes that the State Board of Education cannot develop, administer, or fund standardized assessments for pre-K through second grade, with the exception of, we have to do because it's federally mandated, the access test for, dual language learners. And then there is a screener that we utilize in schools for gifted, talented. There's developmental screeners. There's also, in the state of Illinois, we have a kindergarten individual development survey, which is a teacher observation tool that's administered in the early part of the year to kind of get a sense of what skills children are coming in with and how you might differentiate supports and instruction to meet those needs. But the point is, this particular assessment or this particular piece of legislation just basically bans the state board from, like I said, purchasing, administering, or developing a standardized assessment. So that was great. Now, here's the thing. Here's the caveat. This is where things get tricky in legislation. School districts with their own local funds, they can still administer. Like in Illinois, we are a local control state. So you still have school districts with their own school boards that can, approve their budgets and apply them in that way. It's just that we started with the state not being able to do this with our state funds. And it was pretty contentious. I mean, I had some opposition from, various camps that are kind of like in the education reform space. You had some concerns about like, how will we know how the children are doing in aggregate? And I said, the teachers know very well. We don't need to continue to undermine their expertise. They're collecting data every day on a child. They may not necessarily be able to churn it out in a nice little graph, but they are adjusting and tweaking their practice and their approach and their pedagogy based on the data that they're collecting. They also have conversations with families and caregivers about how to support. We don't need to start our youngest out in this way to kind of become desensitized to or begin to expect the harm that standardized assessments inflict upon young people, and even too, like frankly, the relationship between the test administrator and the child, often the teacher and the child. It just creates a lot of tension. I've been in that horrible situation of having to be a proctor for assessments, and I didn't like what it did for my relationships with students.
Thank you for sharing.
So that's that test. That's that piece of legislation. One other I want to highlight that I think is really important for the field. It is the establishment of a higher education consortium known as the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity. This is the first in the nation where we basically incentivized all of our community colleges and our four-year institutions to enter an agreement to support an effort to upskill the incumbent early childhood workforce. These are individuals who work in various early care and education settings, but may not have the resources or the support to pursue their educational goals. They usually have less than a bachelor's degree, but they are, the critical mass of our workforce. And what we did is in this consortium, one, make sure that if you were pursuing if you had an applied associate's of early childhood education, you would automatically have junior standing at a four-year institution. None of this, oh, well, this class doesn't count and that one doesn't count and you're going to have to take these over. We got rid of that. We also wanted the child development, the CDA, Child Development Assistant credential, that now is awarded college credit that would then be stackable and you're able to pursue a degree. And then we were able to apply $200 million for scholarships to remove all financial barriers for these early childhood professionals. So tuition fees, childcare, past debt, transportation, tutoring, whatever you need, that was not going to be a barrier anymore. And so our goal in the next few years is to upskill about 5,400 current early childhood professionals who do not have a bachelor's degree, so we can fill our vacancies and we can obviously support the quality enhancement of these individuals.
This is so exciting. I can see this big, you being a trailblazer for others, they follow suit, because as you mentioned, with respect to testing, first of all, the relationship is impacted. There's also time taken away, because all the energy spent in testing and preparation is time taken away from relationship building and learning without the anxiety. And also, I know you mentioned that access will continue, but what are your thoughts about access and sort of like federally mandated tests that, for example, Head Start might use, that are run by corporations and that are often and not really genuinely testing the students, because the language of testing is crippling the student. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not a proponent of standardized assessments. I really think they leave a lot to desire. I don't think that they are designed to do what they pretend like, or they portray themselves to do. I think that there's a lot of limitations. And obviously, we've kind of referenced, all of the stress that they bring about, and of course, all the profit that they are able to direct towards private companies. These are public dollars. I mean, there's a lot of problems. When I was on the State Board of Education, I was a very vocal opponent. What I think, though, I don't want to just be a critic and not offer some solutions. I think that we have an opportunity to reimagine what assessment looks like. And as I've kind of referenced, educators are taking in information daily. And I think it is important to kind of analyze progress and how, your students are evolving and their knowledge base and application of knowledge. And there's ways that we can measure, monitor, celebrate, support. And I think we need to consider, if it's maybe at the federal level, we have a framework for assessing progress. And there's a series of tools that we can draw from. And that obviously being informed by practitioners and educators, and not, these psychometricians and these corporations. I think we need to, what was fabulous, although, frightening with the pandemic, how much it harmed our communities. It helped to expose, for a lot of people that were not aware of what's happening on the ground, all of the fractures within our system, this being one of them. And we have to reconsider that after living through a pandemic and, what may have happened from the most extreme situations, or just from more of a, thankfully, if nothing happened to your family directly, but, being on lockdown, having to learn through a screen, having social isolation, all of those things have affected our children, young people, and it's a process in which they need to begin to kind of explore, how do they kind of turn the corner, and what does learning look like? What did we learn from the pandemic, and what are the things that we can continue to build on, instead of like reverting back to our old ways of using, these click on this, click on that, so that we can see where we measure you up against everyone else. It's all, socially constructed, and for what purpose and to what end. And so I actually had an opportunity to meet with the Secretary of Education, Cardona, and really exciting that he was a practitioner, and that, he's kind of rank and file and he's worked his way up. But I said, we need to decolonize, our education systems, and assessments are one of the tools of colonization. And we need to reimagine, and we need to anchor our solutions in our practitioners and the expertise that they are applying every single day in the classroom. Because if we go back, it's such a mistake. So, obviously I'm not, I'm not here for those assessments.
This is impressive that you've been able to push. So you're absolutely right. Assessment is fluid, and alternative assessments, particularly in the early years with parents and family members, because sometimes the parents are not always the ones in charge. As we know, many families have other family members who are also playing that role when the mothers or the fathers are working, and they may not be biologically related, but this kind of partnership that is going to evolve as a result of this is going to be really brilliant. So I was wondering, as a testament to the power of bilingualism, you yourself, being fluid and fluent in Spanish and English, and I understand, I don't know if you're fluent in Italian, but I understand part of your heritage is also Italian, and so, but you're bilingual, definitely, right?
I would say bilingual, like not fully biliterate. I wasn't, I wasn't educated in Spanish. That became actually my major in college, and I studied abroad to like really refine it. And thankfully, every job I've had has required me to speak Spanish. So I've been able to improve that. Would I say it's my dominant language? No. If I have to explain some things in policy, I'm going to need some prep, because that's a very, that's a different vocabulary.
Yeah, the
But I
register
can
is
defend
different.
myself if I needed to.
And so you do qualify as a bilingual and a bicultural who also translanguages, as you know, as we use the word translanguaging to capture what was formerly known as code switching, but it's a whole body experience, because even the proxemics, the kinesics, the body language also is indicative of this switch and meshing. And those of us in the practice of dual language education are trying to push for more translanguaging as a pedagogy and as a way for teachers to actually demonstrate how students can then make English more comprehensible for themselves and as a practice. So I'm curious, do you have any plans for pedagogy, and how much of this has to do with either bilingualizing English instruction, if I may use that, dual language education, and of course, assessment?
Yeah, no, I could speak a little bit about that, and just heads up, I've got to go pick up
Right.
kids. So
We'll be wrapping up shortly.
After this,
Yeah.
but I would say a couple things, in the context of Illinois. So we made bilingual education mandated for preschool. So if you are in a state-funded preschool classroom, there is a requirement that you have to go through the home language screener. And then if that indicates that you are a dual language learner, then we call it English language learner, but I have problems with that because I feel like it's, again, a colonizer term.
Yes.
If you're a dual language learner, then you would qualify, for bilingual education that the federal government protects, right? So although we've done some things that we could do better at. We don't do that screening. That screening is not mandated in our community-based settings that are state funded. So we need to work on that, because that's actually where a lot of our kids show up who are dual language learners. So you have that there, but we have to obviously have the appropriate staffing who have the credentials, who have the both the professional experience as well as, the cultural congruence. And we don't have as many people in the pipeline. So there are efforts to increase that pipeline. For example, we have what we call the Minority Teaching Initiative Scholarship that is specifically designated for underrepresented individuals who want to pursue what we call a professional educator license. And there's a specific set aside for individuals who are bilingual to be able to kind of have some of those resources protected so we can, accelerate folks in there. We also have the seal of biliteracy in the state, and that is applied at the elementary level as well as the high school level. If a school has a dual language immersion or, a program where dual language, not just bilingual ed. And so that is available, and we graduate, several hundred, if not thousands of students annually from high school with that seal. My children, for example, go to a dual language immersion elementary school where
exciting.
Miss Santiago, who I know is pursuing her doctorate, super exciting, it was teaching. And, it's an 80-20 model, that starts in pre-K and goes all the way to 8th grade. And I think it's at the 5th grade mark, they start to, it becomes 50-50, but certain subjects are only taught in Spanish, like math is only taught in Spanish. So you really develop that academic language as well as the thought processes to compute math in Spanish. So there's, the Chicago Public Schools has been expanding their investments in dual language programs. But obviously when you have seals of biliteracy, when you have some of these designated scholarships, that incentivizes. But we definitely need a lot more. I mean, in fact, I think every child should have access to a dual language immersion program. We know what it does for the brain. We obviously know what it does for human connections and being able to, have even deeper relationships with relatives that speak other languages and community members and so on and so forth. So there's all of those things. And then of course, on the assessment tip, I know we were working on a native language Spanish assessment for our language arts as a state. There was a little bit of a process underway to start to kind of get that going, and I'm not quite sure where it left off. We've had a transition with our superintendent. And so but I know that there's a lot of awareness on the table and a desire to address precisely what you said, is that the language of an assessment is really assessing your, ability to regurgitate English and not the subject content area. And so we have to do much better with that.
This is so exciting. And I know that with you in office, pilot level differences will be considered because, there's so many variations in Spanish. For example, in Puerto Rico, a lot of the students who are being tested in Spanish have for the longest time actually have had the lowest scores in Spanish. And I hypothesize it's because what the Spanish version being used is not matching what's been spoken. But I know you have to go. So Senator, go pick up your children. This is so wonderful. So Senator goes, picks up her own children. This is wonderful. Thank you for your time. Muchas gracias.